The summer heat in New Orleans pressed down like a weight that refused to lift. Even at 9 p.m, the air inside Riverview Restaurant clung thick and damp, carrying the scent of butter, garlic, and something sharper, sweat mixed with expensive cologne. Lena Cortez had been on her feet for 11 hours straight, moving between tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to read people before they even opened their mouths. Her lower back ached, her calves burned, and the fake smile she'd perfected over 3 years of service work had started to crack around the edges. But she couldn't afford to slow down. Not tonight. Not when tips determined whether she'd make rent or spend another week dodging her landlord's calls. The dining room hummed with the usual Friday night chaos. Businessmen loosening ties after closing deals, tourists snapping photos of their shrimp étouffée, couples leaning across candlelit tables pretending they still had something to say to each other. Lena navigated it all with mechanical precision, her tray balanced perfectly, her responses timed to the second. She'd become invisible in the way all good servers learn to be, present enough to anticipate needs, absent enough not to intrude on private moments. That's why she noticed him immediately. Table 12, corner booth, half hidden by the decorative screen that separated the main floor from the quieter section, reserved for regulars who paid extra for discretion. Damien Levesque. She'd served him before, 3 times in the past 2 months. Always the same routine. He arrived exactly at 8:30, always alone except for the bodyguard who sat 1 table over, always ordered the ribeye medium rare with a single glass of Bordeaux, always left precisely 20%. Never $1 more or less. He never raised his voice, never snapped his fingers for service, never made a scene. And yet every staff member knew to handle his table with surgical care, because the few times someone had made a mistake, brought the wrong wine, interrupted at the wrong moment, they'd been transferred to different shifts within days. Not fired, just moved. As if an invisible hand had reached in and rearranged the schedule without explanation. Lena had learned not to ask questions about men like Damien Levesque. In a city where half the powerful families had roots tangled in things polite society didn't discuss, survival meant keeping your eyes down and your observations to yourself. She knew he was someone important in ways that didn't appear on tax returns. She knew the slight Italian accent that colored his English hinted at connections that stretched across the Atlantic. She knew the custom suits he wore cost more than she made in 6 months, and she knew that tonight, something was different. It started with the bodyguard, Marcus. That's what Damien called him, the one time she'd overheard their brief exchange 3 weeks ago. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that came from military training or worse. He usually sat with perfect posture, eyes constantly scanning the room, hands resting on the table in a way that suggested he could reach for a weapon in under a second. But tonight, Marcus was fidgeting. Lena caught it on her 3rd pass through the section, the way his right hand kept moving to his jacket pocket, then pulling away, the way his jaw clenched when Damien spoke to him, the way his eyes tracked not the room's entrances like usual, but the back exit near the kitchen, the one staff used for smoke breaks and deliveries. She told herself she was imagining things, that 11 hours on her feet had turned normal behavior into paranoid pattern recognition, that men like Marcus probably had 1,000 reasons to be tense that had nothing to do with her or anyone else in this restaurant. But then she saw the envelope. It happened during the dinner rush, when the noise level peaked and everyone's attention was fragmented across a dozen simultaneous demands. Lena had just delivered appetizers to table 9 when she turned and caught it. Marcus leaning slightly toward a man who'd approached from the direction of the restrooms, a stranger she'd never seen before. Middle-aged, unremarkable face, wearing a jacket too heavy for the summer heat. The kind of person you'd forget 2 seconds after they walked past. The exchange took maybe 3 seconds. The stranger's hand emerged from his pocket with a thin manila envelope. Marcus's hand moved to accept it, the motion smooth and practiced, tucking it inside his jacket in a single fluid gesture before his arm returned to rest on the table as if nothing had happened. Lena's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She forced herself to keep moving, to deliver the water pitcher to table 7, to laugh at the tourists' joke about alligators in the French Quarter, to maintain the performance of normalcy even as her mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was legitimate business. Maybe she'd misread the entire situation, and the paranoia of working in a city where everyone seemed to have secrets was finally catching up with her. But she couldn't shake the feeling, and as the evening wore on, the signs multiplied. Marcus checking his phone under the table, quick glances, thumb moving across the screen in rapid bursts, the kind of texting someone does when they're coordinating something in real time. Marcus avoiding eye contact with Damien, even when directly addressed, answering in monosyllables instead of his usual crisp acknowledgments. Marcus's leg bouncing under the table, a nervous rhythm that didn't match the calm, controlled persona he'd always projected before. And most telling of all, Marcus looking at his watch. Not once, not twice, but 6 times in the span of 20 minutes, each glance lasting just long enough to track the movement of time with the focus of someone counting down to a deadline. Lena had grown up in a neighborhood where you learned to read danger in the tilt of someone's shoulders, the shift in their voice, the moment when casual attention became predatory focus. She'd survived 3 years of service work by knowing when a customer's anger would stop at rudeness and when it would escalate into something that required the manager's intervention. She'd developed instincts that had kept her safe in situations where hesitation could cost everything. And every single one of those instincts was screaming that Marcus was a man waiting for something to happen, something planned, something soon. She thought about the envelope again, about the stranger who'd delivered it with the practiced ease of someone completing a transaction, about the way Marcus had accepted it without surprise, as if he'd been expecting it. Payment for services rendered, or services about to be rendered. The thought crystallized with sudden, horrible clarity. Marcus wasn't protecting Damien tonight. He was delivering him. Lena's hands shook as she picked up the dessert menus. This wasn't her problem. She was a waitress, not a bodyguard, not a detective, not someone who got involved in whatever dark business happened in the shadows of men who wore $10,000 watches and commanded rooms with silence. Getting involved would be stupid, dangerous, potentially fatal. But she couldn't unknow what she'd seen, couldn't unsee the patterns, couldn't ignore the countdown happening at table 12, where a man who'd never shown her anything but distant politeness was sitting completely unaware that his own protection had turned against him. Lena retreated to the kitchen under the pretense of checking on orders, her pulse hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The industrial fans did nothing to cut through the wall of heat rising from the grills, and the controlled chaos of cooks shouting orders, pans clattering, and timers beeping created a wall of noise that felt both protective and suffocating. She pressed her back against the cool stainless steel of the walk-in refrigerator and forced herself to breathe. Think. Process. What exactly had she seen? A bodyguard accepting an envelope. A bodyguard checking his phone. A bodyguard looking tense. That wasn't evidence. That was speculation. She could be completely wrong. Marcus could be dealing with personal problems, financial trouble, family crisis, health issues. The envelope could contain anything. The phone checking could be about his sick mother, his kid's school emergency, his gambling debts. The tension could stem from 1,000 sources that had nothing to do with betrayal. But even as she tried to talk herself down, her mind kept circling back to one detail that wouldn't let go, the way Marcus had positioned himself tonight. Usually, his table gave him a clear line of sight to both entrances, the main doors at the front and the service exit in the back. Perfect placement for someone whose job was to identify threats before they materialized. But tonight, he'd chosen a different angle. Tonight, his back was partially to the front entrance. His attention focused primarily on that rear exit where the stranger had approached, where staff came and went without the kind of scrutiny guests received at the host stand. Tonight, Marcus had positioned himself to control not who came in, but who went out. "Lena, you good?" Rico, one of the line cooks, called over his shoulder while flipping a salmon fillet. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She pushed off the refrigerator, manufacturing a smile. Just hot. Needed a second. Tell me about it. We're drowning back here. He gestured at the ticket rail, where orders hung in a line that seemed to multiply every time she looked away. Table 8 is asking about their entrees. Right. Work. The job. The reason she was here and the thing that would keep her alive if she minded her own business and let whatever was about to happen without her interference. She grabbed Table 8's orders and pushed back through the swinging doors into the dining room. The ambient noise hit her like a wave. Laughter, conversation, the clink of silverware on china, the soft jazz playing through the restaurant's sound system. Normal. Everything looked completely normal. Except Table 12, where Damien was cutting his ribeye with precise, economical movements, and Marcus was staring at his phone again, thumb scrolling, jaw tight. Lena delivered the entrees to Table 8, accepted their thanks with automated warmth, and found herself drifting closer to Table 12 under the pretense of checking water glasses in that section. She was violating every rule of good service, hovering, lingering, inserting herself into a situation where she hadn't been summoned. But she couldn't help it. The countdown was happening whether she watched or not, and some part of her needed to witness it, to confirm she wasn't losing her mind. That's when she saw the second exchange. Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced down, read something, then looked up. Not at Damien, but past him, toward that back exit. And in the doorway, half hidden by the decorative screen, stood another stranger. Younger this time, maybe late 20s, wearing a server's uniform that didn't quite fit right, the shirt untucked in a way that suggested he'd put it on in a hurry. Lena knew every staff member who worked Friday nights. This man wasn't one of them. Her breath caught as Marcus gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible, just a fractional dip of his chin. The fake server nodded back and disappeared into the hallway that led to the kitchen and the rear loading dock. Positioning. Coordination. Signals. This wasn't paranoia. This was a plan in motion. Lena's mind raced through options. She could tell the manager, but what would she say? That she had a bad feeling about a guest's bodyguard? That she'd seen him accept an envelope and text on his phone? None of that was evidence of anything criminal. She'd sound hysterical, and in the service industry, hysterical women got labeled as dramatic and unstable and found themselves on the schedule for terrible shifts. Or, worse, not on the schedule at all. She could call the police, but that came with its own problems. Men like Damien Levesque didn't appreciate police attention, even when it came from good intentions. And if she was wrong, if Marcus really was just having a bad night, and she'd triggered a police response based on nothing but instinct, the fallout would be catastrophic. She'd lose her job, possibly get blacklisted from other restaurants. In a city where reputation was everything, and the service industry ran on networks of mutual recommendations, that kind of mistake could follow her for years. She could do nothing. Walk away. Let whatever was going to happen, happen. Men like Damien had resources, backup plans, connections that people like her couldn't imagine. Maybe he already knew. Maybe this was some kind of test, some elaborate power play in a world where betrayal and counter-betrayal were just part of the game. Maybe her interference would do more harm than good. But as she watched Marcus check his watch again, the 7th time, she knew she couldn't walk away. Not because she was brave or heroic, or had some inflated sense of her own importance, but because she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and if Damien died tonight because she'd kept silent, she'd carry that weight forever. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. She couldn't warn him directly. Marcus would see, would know immediately that something had gone wrong. She couldn't make a scene without triggering whatever response Marcus and his accomplices had prepared for interference. She had one chance, one moment, one small window to slip information across the gap between her world and Damien's. She needed to write it down. Lena grabbed her order pad and pen, retreating to the service station where servers kept supplies and did their quiet calculations between tables. Her hand shook as she pressed pen to paper, trying to find words that would convey urgency without sounding insane, that would communicate danger without getting dismissed as the ravings of an overwrought waitress. Her first attempt was too long, too detailed, too easy to dismiss. She tore the page off, crumpled it, started again. The second attempt was too vague, too cryptic, too likely to be ignored as a prank or mistake. The third attempt hit the mark. Your bodyguard made a deal. You're the payment. Don't use the front exit. Simple, direct, specific enough to be actionable, vague enough not to reveal how much she'd actually seen. If she was wrong, he'd think she was crazy and forget about it. If she was right, those 20 words might save his life. She folded the note small, tucking it into her palm, and took a breath that did nothing to steady her racing heart. The dining room seemed to have grown quieter, or maybe she was just hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every potential threat. She could see Marcus from here, still at his table, still checking his phone, still tracking time with the focus of someone waiting for a signal. Now or never. Lena picked up the leather check presenter from the service station and approached table 12 with the carefully neutral expression of someone performing a routine task she'd done 1,000 times before. Damien looked up as she approached, his dark eyes registering her presence with the kind of attention that suggested he remembered her from previous visits. He had that quality some people possessed, the ability to make you feel like the only person in the room, even when his focus lasted only seconds. It wasn't warmth, exactly. More like the intensity of someone who'd learned that missing details could be fatal. "Just checking if you'd like dessert this evening, Mr. Levesque," Lena said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming through her veins. "Or I can bring your check whenever you're ready." The check would be fine. His accent gave the words a musical quality that didn't match the hardness in his eyes. "Thank you." She set the leather presenter on the table, her hand positioning it so the edge touched his water glass. A normal placement. Nothing unusual about it. Except that folded inside, beneath the printed receipt, was the note that could either save his life or destroy hers. Marcus glanced up from his phone, his gaze tracking her movements with sudden, sharp attention. She met his eyes for just a second, long enough to be polite, not long enough to suggest she knew anything, and then turned away, walking back toward the service station with measured steps that took every ounce of control to maintain. Don't run. Don't look back. Don't give anything away. She made it 3 steps before her legs started to shake. 5 steps before she had to grip the edge of a chair to steady herself. 7 steps before she reached the relative safety of the service station and pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the coffee machine, willing her heart to slow down. What had she just done? Behind her, she heard the subtle sound of leather sliding against wood. Damien opening the check presenter. Her entire body tensed, waiting for the reaction. Would he laugh? Call her over? Ignore it completely? Show it to Marcus? The seconds stretched into something liquid and endless, time moving at a pace that felt divorced from reality. The restaurant continued its normal rhythms around her. Orders being taken, food being delivered, couples arguing quietly over who would pay the bill. But Lena existed in a bubble of suspended animation. Every nerve ending focused on the man at table 12, and whatever was happening in his mind as he read those 20 words she'd risked everything to deliver. She couldn't see his face from this angle, couldn't read his reaction, could only wait and wonder if she'd just signed her own death warrant by inserting herself into business that belonged to a world she'd spent her entire life trying to avoid. Then movement. Damien's hand reaching into his jacket pocket, pulling out a slim leather wallet, the crisp sound of bills being placed inside the check presenter, the soft scrape of his chair as he stood. Lena's breath stopped. This was it, the moment of truth. Either he'd believed her and was about to act, or he'd dismissed her warning and was walking into whatever trap Marcus had arranged, and she'd have to watch it happen knowing she'd tried and failed. But instead of heading toward the front entrance, the normal route, the expected path. Damien turned and walked toward the kitchen, not quickly, not with any visible urgency. Just a calm, purposeful stride that suggested he'd made a simple decision about using the restroom, or speaking with the manager, or any of a dozen normal reasons a guest might head toward the back of the restaurant. Except Lena saw the micro-expression that crossed Marcus's face when Damien changed direction. Surprise, then confusion, then something that looked like the beginning of panic. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "Mr. Levesque," he called, his voice carrying a note of strain that broke through his usually perfect composure. "Sir, the restroom is—" But Damien didn't stop, didn't acknowledge him. Just kept walking with that same unhurried pace, disappearing through the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. And then everything happened at once. Marcus was moving toward the kitchen doors when his phone buzzed. He glanced down, read something, and his expression shifted from panic to something harder. He changed course, heading instead for the back exit, not running, but moving with clear purpose, one hand inside his jacket where Lena knew he kept his weapon. The fake server she'd spotted earlier emerged from the hallway, also heading for the exit. His hand pressed to an earpiece she could now see wasn't part of any restaurant-issued equipment. The dining room, oblivious to the currents of violence flowing beneath the surface of normal Friday evening service, continued its pleasant buzz of conversation and laughter. People eating expensive meals, celebrating anniversaries, making business deals, completely unaware that somewhere in the spaces between their tables, a betrayal years in the making was collapsing in real time. Lena stood frozen at the service station, her hands gripping the counter so hard her knuckles had gone white. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to distance herself from whatever was about to explode. But her feet wouldn't move. She'd started this by passing that note. She'd diverted Damien from walking into an ambush. And now she needed to see how it ended. Needed to know if her intervention had saved him or just delayed the inevitable. The kitchen doors swung open again, and Rico emerged carrying a tray of desserts, completely unbothered. "Hey, Lena, Table 6 wants to see you about. Are you okay? You look like you're gonna pass out." She tried to respond, but her throat had closed around the words. Instead, she just shook her head, her eyes still tracking the back exit where Marcus and the fake server had disappeared. "Seriously, you need to sit down." Rico set the tray on the service station and gripped her elbow, his touch bringing her back into her body, into the present moment. "When's the last time you ate something? You're white as a sheet." "I'm fine," she managed, her voice coming out hoarse. "Just need a minute. Take 5 in the office. I'll cover your section." She wanted to argue, wanted to stay and watch for whatever came next, but Rico was already guiding her toward the back hallway, past the kitchen, toward the small manager's office where staff went to cry or quit or hide when the pressure of public-facing service became too much. They passed the open door to the loading dock, and Lena caught a glimpse of the alley beyond. Dark, except for the single security light that cast everything in harsh shadows. Empty. No sign of Marcus or the fake server or anyone else who might have been waiting there. No sign of Damien either. Rico deposited her in the manager's office with instructions to drink water and breathe, then disappeared back toward the dining room. Lena sank into the battered desk chair and stared at the wall calendar without seeing it, her mind replaying the last 10 minutes on a loop, searching for clues about what happened after Damien walked through those kitchen doors. Had he slipped out through the loading dock? Did he have backup she hadn't seen? Was he already dead in some alley, her warning arriving too late to change anything? Or had he known all along? Had her note simply confirmed suspicions he'd been harboring for weeks, giving him the final piece of information he needed to act first, instead of waiting to be acted upon? She didn't know. Had no way of knowing. And the not knowing felt like drowning in slow motion. The office door opened without warning, and Lena's head snapped up, her heart launching into her throat as she prepared for— she didn't even know what. Marcus coming to eliminate the witness? The police wanting to question her? The manager firing her for causing some kind of disturbance she still didn't fully understand. But it was just Sarah, the hostess, poking her head in with a concerned expression. "Hey, you okay? Rico said you weren't feeling well." "Yeah, just needed a minute." Lena forced herself to stand, to move, to return to the performance of normalcy, even though nothing felt normal anymore. "I'm good now. Back to work." "You sure? Because if you need to go home..." "I'm sure." She pushed past Sarah and back into the kitchen, where the organized chaos continued unchanged. Cooks shouting orders, plates being assembled, the industrial dishwasher roaring through another cycle. Everything exactly as it had been before she'd passed that note, before Damien had disappeared, before the world had tilted sideways. Lena returned to the dining room, her legs still unsteady, and scanned for table 12. Empty. The dishes had been cleared. The check presenter was gone. In its place sat a neat stack of bills, payment for the meal, plus exactly 20% gratuity, just like always. As if nothing unusual had happened. As if Damien Levesque had simply finished his dinner and left like any other customer. Except he hadn't used the front door. And Marcus hadn't returned. And somewhere in the city beyond these walls, consequences were unfolding that she'd set in motion with 20 words on a piece of paper. The rest of Lena's shift passed in a fog of mechanical action. She took orders without hearing them, delivered food without tasting it in her mind, smiled and nodded, and performed the elaborate dance of service work, while her thoughts spiraled through increasingly dark scenarios. Every time the front door opened, she tensed, expecting police or men in expensive suits, or Marcus returning to tie up loose ends. Every unexpected sound made her flinch. Every shadow in her peripheral vision became a potential threat. But nothing happened. The dinner rush wound down into the quieter, late-night crowd. Tourists lingered over coffee. Local regulars nursed final drinks at the bar. The kitchen started breaking down their stations. And Lena moved through it all like a ghost haunting her own life, present, but not really there. By the time her shift ended at midnight, she'd convinced herself she'd imagined the whole thing, that her overactive pattern recognition had assembled normal events into a paranoid fantasy. That tomorrow she'd wake up and laugh at herself for writing that melodramatic note and sneaking it onto a customer's table like she was living in some kind of thriller novel instead of just surviving another Friday night in the service industry. She changed out of her work clothes in the tiny employee bathroom, stuffing her sweat-damp shirt into her bag and pulling on the oversized cardigan she wore for the walk home. The restaurant had mostly emptied by now, just a few stragglers at the bar and the closing staff counting out their tills. She waved goodbye to Rico and Sarah, declined their offer to wait for her so they could walk out together, and pushed through the back exit into the humid New Orleans night. The alley behind Riverview looked different in the dark. Longer, narrower, full of shadows that the weak security light couldn't quite dispel. Dumpsters lined one wall, their lids closed but still emanating the sweet rot smell of garbage in summer heat. The buildings on either side rose high enough to block most of the ambient light from the street, creating a corridor of darkness that Lena had to walk through to reach the main road. She'd made this walk hundreds of times before without thinking twice. But tonight, every step felt weighted with possibility. Her ears strained for sounds that didn't belong. Footsteps behind her, breathing in the shadows, the scrape of metal on metal that might be a weapon being drawn. Her keys were already between her fingers, the makeshift weapon of women who'd learned to be ready for violence that might come from any direction. But the alley remained quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic on the main road, and the closer sound of her own footsteps echoing off brick walls. She reached the street without incident, turned right toward the bus stop, and started to breathe easier. Maybe she really had imagined it. Maybe Damien had just wanted to avoid the crowds at the front entrance. Maybe Marcus had stepped out for a phone call. Maybe the fake server had been a new hire she simply hadn't met yet. Maybe the envelope had contained insurance documents, or a birthday card, or something completely innocuous that her overactive imagination had transformed into evidence of conspiracy. The bus arrived on schedule, mostly empty at this hour. Lena collapsed into a seat near the back and let her head rest against the window, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the adrenaline had burned off. Her apartment was only 4 stops away, 20 minutes, and she'd be home. She'd deadbolt the door, take a shower hot enough to strip away the smell of the kitchen, and sleep for the next 12 hours straight. She almost made it. The bus was pulling up to her stop when she saw the car. Black sedan, expensive, parked directly in front of her building with the engine running. Not idling like someone waiting for a passenger. Running like someone ready to move quickly if needed. Lena's hand tightened around her bag strap. It could be nothing. Could be someone visiting a neighbor. Could be a rideshare waiting for their customer. Could be completely unrelated to her or Damien or anything that had happened tonight. But she didn't believe in coincidences anymore. She stayed on the bus past her stop, riding it 3 more blocks before getting off and walking back through side streets, approaching her building from a different angle. The sedan was still there, still running. And as she got closer, hugging the shadows of the buildings across the street, she could make out the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat. Too dark to see details, but the posture was wrong. Too alert, too focused, like someone on a job rather than someone killing time. Lena's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building with no back entrance. To get inside, she'd have to walk past that car, past whoever was sitting in it, past whatever reason they had for being there. Her phone was in her bag, charged but suddenly feeling useless. Who would she call? The police? To report a parked car? That would go nowhere. A friend? To come rescue her? She didn't have anyone close enough for that. Hadn't built those kinds of relationships in the 3 years since she'd moved to New Orleans for a fresh start, that had turned into just another version of barely surviving. She stood in the shadow of a closed storefront, trying to decide what to do, when the car door opened. A woman got out. Tall, professional, wearing slacks and a blazer despite the heat. She walked directly to Lena's building entrance, pressed a button on the intercom system, waited. When no one answered, because Lena wasn't home to buzz her in, she pulled out her phone and made a call. 30 seconds later, Lena's phone buzzed in her bag. Unknown number, local area code. Her hand shook as she pulled it out and stared at the screen. Let it ring once, twice, 3 times. If she didn't answer, would they leave, or would they wait? And if they waited, how long until they got tired of waiting and decided to take more direct action? On the 4th ring, she answered. Hello? Miss Cortez. A woman's voice, calm and professional, like a lawyer or a very expensive personal assistant. My name is Victoria. I work for Mr. Levesque. He'd like to speak with you briefly if you have a moment. I'm parked outside your building. Lena's mouth went dry. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know any Mr. Levesque. Yes, you do. You served him dinner tonight at Riverview. You also provided him with information that proved extremely valuable. A pause. He'd like to thank you personally. The words, thank you, shouldn't have sounded threatening. But something in Victoria's tone made it clear this wasn't really a request. This was a summons dressed up in polite language, the kind of invitation that came with consequences if declined. I can't right now, Lena said, backing further into the shadows. I'm not home. You're standing in the doorway of Paolo's bakery, which is closed for the night. Victoria's voice remained pleasant. You're wearing a gray cardigan over a white tank top. Your hair is pulled back in a ponytail. Should I continue? Fear shot through Lena's chest like electricity. They'd been watching her, following her, tracking her movements with enough precision to know exactly where she was, what she was wearing, how she'd tried to avoid them. What does he want? Her voice came out smaller than she intended. To talk. Nothing more. I promise you're not in danger, Miss Cortez. If Mr. Levesque wanted to harm you, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Another pause. He simply wants to meet the person who saved his life. Is that so unreasonable? Lena's mind raced through options. Run. But where? They clearly had resources to find her. Hide. But for how long? Call the police and say what? That she'd gotten involved in something she didn't understand and now couldn't get out? If I agree to meet him, she said slowly, will you leave me alone after? That depends on what's discussed, but I can guarantee your safety during the meeting and transport both ways. You have my word. The word of a stranger working for a man she'd served dinner to 3 times. Not exactly reassuring. But what choice did she have? Okay, Lena heard herself say. But somewhere public. Not his house or office or wherever. Of course. There's a coffee shop on Magazine Street, La Petite Rose. Do you know it? She did. Open 24 hours. Usually busy even late at night with the post-bar crowd. Public enough to feel safer than an alley or a private residence. I can be there in 20 minutes. Perfect. Mr. Levesque will meet you there. Victoria paused. And Miss Cortez? Thank you for agreeing. He doesn't forget people who help him. That's not common in his world. The line went dead before Lena could respond. She stood in the doorway of the closed bakery for another minute, trying to process what had just happened. Then she pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and started walking toward Magazine Street, toward La Petite Rose, toward a meeting with a man whose life she'd saved, but whose world she didn't understand, toward consequences she couldn't predict and couldn't avoid. La Petite Rose occupied a corner location with floor-to-ceiling windows that spilled warm light onto the sidewalk. Even at 1 a.m, it bustled with activity. Students bent over laptops, musicians unwinding after late-night gigs, insomniacs seeking company and caffeine. The familiar smell of espresso and baked goods hit Lena as she pushed through the door, and for a moment, she almost convinced herself this was just another late-night coffee run. Nothing unusual about it. Then she saw him. Damien sat alone at a corner table, positioned so his back was to the wall, and he had a clear view of both entrances. No bodyguard this time. No Marcus to watch his blind spots. Just him, wearing a simple black shirt and slacks, looking like any other customer except for the way he held himself. That particular stillness that suggested coiled violence barely restrained. He saw her immediately, his dark eyes locking onto hers across the crowded coffee shop. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement that said, I see you. I've been waiting. Lena forced her feet to move, navigating between tables until she stood in front of him, her hands clutched around her bag strap like it might anchor her against whatever was coming. Sit, he said. Not a command exactly, but not a request either. The kind of statement that assumed compliance. She sat. Up close, she could see details she'd missed during their brief interactions at the restaurant. The faint scar along his jawline, mostly hidden by the careful grooming of his beard. The silver ring on his right hand, engraved with symbols she didn't recognize. The way his eyes tracked not just her, but everything around them. The couple arguing 2 tables over, the barista wiping down the counter, the guy who'd just walked in and was now ordering at the register. He was always watching, always assessing, living in a state of permanent vigilance that must be exhausting. You want coffee? He asked. I want to know why I'm here. A slight smile touched his lips, there and gone in an instant. Fair enough. You're here because you did something tonight that very few people would have the courage, or the stupidity, to do. He leaned forward slightly. You warned me. Why? Lena's mouth felt dry despite the humid air. I saw something that didn't feel right. I thought you should know. What exactly did you see? She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, how much he already knew. Your bodyguard, Marcus. He was acting strange all night, nervous, checking his phone constantly, looking at his watch like he was tracking time. And I saw him accept an envelope from someone I didn't recognize. Then later, I I saw him signal to a guy wearing a server uniform that didn't fit right. She paused. It looked like they were coordinating something, and you were the target. Damien listened without interruption, his expression neutral, giving nothing away. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming once against the table, a brief release of some internal energy. "You have good instincts," he said finally. "Everything you saw was accurate. Marcus had been offered a substantial amount of money to deliver me to people who've wanted me dead for 3 years. Tonight was supposed to be the night." He paused. "Your note gave me the 30 seconds I needed to change the outcome. What happened to him? To Marcus? What happens to traitors in my line of work?" His voice carried no emotion, just stating a fact. "You don't need details." Lena's stomach turned, but she forced herself not to look away. "And the people who hired him?" "Also handled. They won't be a problem anymore." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You're afraid of me?" "Yes." "Good. Fear is honest." He leaned back in his chair. "But you should also know that I don't hurt people who help me. You saved my life tonight. That creates a debt. I don't want anything from you." "I know. That's why I'm offering." He pulled something from his pocket and set it on the table between them. A small black box, the kind that might hold jewelry. "Open it." Lena stared at the box like it might contain a bomb. "What is it?" "Open it and see." Her hands shook as she picked it up and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a pendant, heavy metal, intricately carved with a symbol that looked like a stylized crown merged with a wolf's head. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of thing that cost more than she made in a year. "That mark represents protection," Damien said quietly. "Anyone in New Orleans who knows what it means will know you're under my protection. They'll leave you alone. More than that, if you ever need help, real help, you show that to the right people, and they'll move heaven and earth to give you whatever you need." "I can't accept this." "You already did, the moment you passed me that note." His voice was gentle but immovable. "You inserted yourself into my world, Lena. You don't get to pretend you didn't. But since you did it to save me rather than hurt me, I'm making sure you're protected from the consequences." She closed the box, her fingers trembling. "What consequences?" "People will know you warned me. Word travels in certain circles. Some might see you as an asset, others as a threat. The pendant ensures everyone knows which one you are." He paused. "You're protected. That's not negotiable." The weight of it settled over her like a physical thing. The knowledge that her life had changed irrevocably, that she'd crossed a line she could never uncross. She'd meant to save one man's life. She hadn't considered what it would cost her to do it. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why does it matter so much? You don't know me. I'm nobody. You're somebody who saw something wrong and did something about it, even though it was dangerous. Even though you had nothing to gain. That's not nobody." His eyes held hers with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "People in my world don't operate that way. They calculate. They leverage. They turn every action into a transaction. You didn't. You just acted because you thought it was right." He paused. "That's rare. Worth protecting." Lena looked down at the box in her hands, at the pendant that represented a protection she'd never asked for and couldn't refuse. "What happens now?" "Now you go home. You wear the pendant or don't. Your choice, though I recommend you do. You go back to your life. Nothing changes unless you need it to." He stood smoothing his shirt. "But you should know. I don't forget debts. If you ever need anything, you have a way to reach me now." "How?" He pulled a card from his wallet and set it on the table. Plain white, no logo, just a phone number embossed in black. "That's a direct line. It's always answered. You call, someone will find me." She picked up the card, studying the number like it might reveal secrets. "And if I never call?" "Then you never call, but you'll still be protected. That doesn't expire." He started to walk away, then paused and turned back. "One more thing. The restaurant. You should know that I own Riverview. I have for 5 years. The management company is just a front." Lena's head snapped up. "What?" "I'm telling you because you should know who you're working for. If that changes anything, if you want to leave, there will be no consequences. Full recommendation, severance pay, whatever you need." He held her gaze. "But if you stay with full knowledge. I don't like secrets. Not with people who've earned honesty." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. She'd worked at Riverview for 3 years, never knowing who actually signed her paychecks, never knowing the quiet customer at table 12 was the man who owned the whole operation. "Why tell me?" "Because you passed me a note that saved my life. I think you've earned transparency." A slight smile. "And because I think you'll stay. You're tougher than you look." He walked out of the coffee shop without looking back, leaving Lena sitting alone with a pendant, worth more than she'd make in a decade, and a phone number that connected her to a world she'd spent her whole life trying to avoid. She stayed there for another hour, drinking coffee she didn't taste, trying to process what had happened, trying to understand how a single moment of instinct, seeing something wrong and choosing to act, had tangled her life with someone who operated by rules she didn't understand. Eventually, she walked home. The black sedan was gone from outside her building. The street looked normal, quiet, empty except for the occasional car passing through. She climbed the 3 flights to her apartment, deadbolted the door behind her, and sat on her worn couch staring at the black box sitting on her coffee table. The pendant glinted in the dim light from her kitchen, beautiful and dangerous and impossible to ignore. After a long time, she opened the box and lifted out the pendant. The metal was cold against her palm, heavier than she'd expected. She studied the intricate carving. The crown merged with the wolf, power and predator combined into a single symbol. Then, she clasped it around her neck. 3 weeks passed before Lena saw Damien again, though his presence haunted her days in more subtle ways. The pendant stayed around her neck, hidden beneath her shirt during work shifts, an invisible weight that reminded her with every movement that her life had changed in ways she was still trying to understand. At first, nothing seemed different. She went to work, took orders, delivered food, collected tips. The other servers noticed nothing unusual about her. Why would they? She looked the same, acted the same, smiled the same professional smile while recommending the salmon or explaining that yes, they could absolutely make the pasta without garlic. But Lena noticed the differences. The way certain customers looked at her with sudden recognition when the pendant shifted beneath her shirt, and they caught a glimpse of the chain. The way conversations at nearby tables sometimes stopped when she approached. The way the manager started giving her the better sections, the more generous clients, without explanation. And the cars. Always the cars. Not the same one every time. That would have been too obvious. But she started recognizing the pattern. A dark SUV idling half a block from the bus stop when she left work late. A sedan parked across from her building in the mornings when she left for her shift. Different vehicles, different drivers, but always the same careful distance, always the same watchful presence. She was being protected, watched, guarded by invisible handlers who never approached, never spoke, but made sure she was never truly alone. It should have felt suffocating. Instead, it felt like the first time in her adult life that she could walk home at night without keys between her fingers, could zone out on the bus without constantly scanning for threats, could exist in the world without the low-level anxiety that had been her constant companion since she'd moved to New Orleans 3 years ago. The pendant had made her safe. But it had also marked her as something different, something set apart from the normal flow of life in the service industry. Rico noticed first. "You got a boyfriend?" he asked one night during the post-dinner lull, his tone casual, but his eyes too sharp. "Because I swear I've seen the same car dropping you off twice this week." "Just a friend giving me rides," Lena said, which was technically true. One of her invisible guardians had started offering transportation when the weather turned bad, or her shift ended particularly late. "Uh-huh." Rico didn't look convinced. "Well, your friend drives a car that costs more than my entire annual salary, so either you've moved up in the world, or you're into some stuff I don't want to know about." "The second one," Lena said with a slight smile. "Definitely the second one." Rico laughed and let it drop, but she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that mixed concern and curiosity. He wasn't the only one. Sarah, the hostess, had started asking if everything was okay. One of the line cooks had mentioned seeing her talking to some serious-looking people in the alley during her break. Rumors were building. Not dangerous ones yet, but the kind of low-level gossip that preceded bigger questions. How long until someone connected her to the night Marcus disappeared? How long until someone noticed the way certain customers treated her differently? How long until the protection became a problem instead of a shield? The answer came on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks and 4 days after the incident, when Damien walked into Riverview without a reservation and sat in her section. Alone again. No bodyguard, no obvious security. Just him, taking the same corner booth he'd occupied the night everything changed, looking at her with those dark eyes that saw too much. Lena's hands shook as she poured his water. "Back to your usual table. Old habits." He accepted the water with a nod. "How have you been?" "Fine. Busy." She pulled out her order pad, falling back on professional routine because it was the only thing that felt stable. "Can I start you with—" "Sit down, Lena." "I'm working." "I own the restaurant. Sit down." She glanced around. The dining room was half full, early dinner crowd, nothing requiring immediate attention. Slowly, she slid into the booth across from him, her body tense, ready to spring up the moment someone needed her. "You're wearing it," Damien said, his eyes flicking to where the chain was visible above her collar. "Good. I didn't think I had a choice. You always have a choice, but you made the right one." He leaned back, studying her. "You've noticed the protection." "Kind of hard to miss." She kept her voice low. "People are starting to ask questions. Let them ask. The answers won't hurt you." "Won't they?" She leaned forward. "I'm a waitress who suddenly has expensive cars following her around, and customers treating her like she's someone important. That creates attention. Attention creates problems. Only if you're vulnerable. You're not." He paused. "But I understand your concern. That's actually why I'm here. We need to talk about what comes next." Lena's stomach dropped. "Next? You can't exist in my world and yours simultaneously forever. Eventually, you'll need to choose." His voice was gentle but firm. "Stay at the restaurant, keep your normal life, maintain the protection from a distance. Or," he let the word hang, "or what? Or step further in. Work for me directly. There are positions in my organization that require someone with your particular talents, pattern recognition, attention to detail, the ability to see what others miss." He held her gaze. "You'd be compensated appropriately, protected absolutely, but you'd also be part of my world in a way that can't be undone." "I don't know anything about your world." "You know enough, and you can learn the rest." He paused. "I'm not pressuring you. But I wanted you to understand the option exists. You save my life. That means you have value to me beyond just moral debt." Lena's mind raced. A month ago, she'd been a waitress trying to make rent. Now she was sitting across from a Mafia boss, because that's what he was. She'd stopped pretending otherwise, who was offering her a job that would fundamentally change everything about her life. "Why me?" she asked. "You have hundreds of people who work for you. Why offer this to someone who knows nothing?" "Because people who know nothing haven't been corrupted yet. Because you did the right thing without calculating the benefit. Because I think you're capable of more than serving ribeye to tourists." He leaned forward slightly. "And because I think you're tired of being invisible. I can see it. The way you move through the world like you're apologizing for taking up space. The way you never ask for anything, never demand respect, never act like you deserve better than whatever scraps life throws at you." His words hit too close to truth Lena had spent years avoiding. "And working for you would fix that? Working for me would give you resources and protection and power. What you do with those things is up to you." He paused. "But yes, in my world, you wouldn't be invisible anymore, for better or worse." She thought about her apartment with the broken air conditioning and the landlord who ignored her calls. Thought about the bus rides and the late shifts and the constant calculation of whether she could afford groceries this week. Thought about the years ahead, repeating this same pattern until her body gave out, or she finally saved enough to start over somewhere else. Then she thought about the pendant around her neck, about the protection that had made the last 3 weeks the safest she'd felt in years, about the way certain doors had started opening just because people recognized that she belonged to something larger than herself. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course, there's no deadline." Damien stood, leaving several $100 bills on the table. "But think honestly, Lena. Don't tell yourself you're happy with invisible safety and anonymous protection if what you actually want is to be seen." He walked out, leaving her sitting alone in the booth with those words echoing in her head. The rest of her shift passed in a daze. She took orders, delivered food, smiled at customers, performed all the expected motions while her mind circled around the decision she didn't want to admit she'd already made. Because he was right. She was tired of being invisible, tired of apologizing for existing, tired of living small and safe and careful because taking risks meant exposing herself to dangers she couldn't protect against. But with Damien's protection, with his resources and his power and his world, risk meant something different. Meant possibility instead of threat. 3 days later, she made the call. The line was answered on the first ring. "Miss Cortez, Mr. Levesque has been expecting your call. Tell him I accept." "Excellent. Someone will be in touch within the hour regarding transition logistics." She hung up and sat on her worn couch, staring at the wall, feeling the weight of the choice she'd just made settle into her bones. An hour later, exactly as promised, there was a knock at her door. When Lena opened it, Damien stood there, alone, holding a leather portfolio. Quick response time on the decision. "I figured if I was going to do it, better to do it fast before I talked myself out of it." Smart. He stepped inside when she gestured, his presence making her small apartment feel even smaller. "I have paperwork for you to sign. Employment contract, non-disclosure agreement, banking information for direct deposit. It's all standard, but you should read everything carefully." She took the portfolio and flipped through the documents. The salary number made her stop breathing for a moment, more than she currently made in a year, listed as a monthly payment. "This can't be right." "It's right. That's entry level for the position I'm offering you." He pulled out a sleek phone, newer model than anything she'd ever owned. "Encrypted. Direct line to my office and key personnel. You'll receive training over the next 3 weeks. Basic security protocols, how to recognize threats, emergency procedures. Nothing dangerous yet. Just information." "Yet," she repeated softly. "Yet. You'll start with analysis work. Reviewing reports, identifying patterns, flagging inconsistencies. The same skills you used to spot Marcus's betrayal, but applied systematically." He paused. "Eventually, if you're good at it, and I think you will be, There are opportunities to move into more active roles, but no pressure. You decide your own path. Lena set down the portfolio and looked at him directly. Why are you doing this? Really? Because loyalty is rare. Because competence is valuable. Because I think you're capable of more than you've been allowed to become. He held her gaze. And because the night you passed me that note, you proved you could make the hard choice when it mattered. I need people who can do that. She thought about all the reasons she should say no, about the normal life she'd be leaving behind, about the danger she'd be walking toward. Then she thought about the alternative. More years of invisible safety, more shifts at Riverview, more apologizing for taking up space in a world that barely noticed she existed. When do I start? Damien smiled, the expression transforming his usually severe features into something almost warm. Tomorrow. But tonight we celebrate your last shift as a waitress. He gestured toward the door. There's a car waiting. I'm taking you to dinner, somewhere you won't have to serve anyone. Lena grabbed her jacket, her heart pounding with something that felt like fear and anticipation, and the dangerous thrill of stepping off a cliff into empty air. As she followed Damien out of her apartment and down to the waiting car, not one of the surveillance vehicles, but a sleek sedan with a driver who nodded respectfully. She realized she'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade. She'd stopped being invisible. And as the car pulled away from the curb, carrying her toward whatever came next, Lena touched the pendant at her throat and thought about that night at Riverview, when she'd slipped a warning to a stranger who turned out to be anything but. She'd saved his life. And in doing so, she'd changed her own. The car wound through the French Quarter, past the neon-lit bars and restaurants where tourists stumbled between venues, past the quieter residential streets where iron balconies dripped with jasmine, until they reached a part of the city Lena had only seen in passing, the Garden District, where mansions hid behind walls and gates that whispered old money and older secrets. The driver pulled up to a restaurant she'd heard about, but never imagined entering. Commander's Palace. The kind of place where reservations were made months in advance, and a single meal cost what she usually spent on groceries for a week. The building glowed like a Victorian jewel box, its turquoise and white exterior lit dramatically against the darkness, palm trees swaying gently in the warm breeze. I can't go in there dressed like this, Lena said, suddenly aware of her worn jeans and simple cardigan, the practical clothes of someone who'd been expecting to spend the evening signing paperwork in her apartment, not dining at one of New Orleans' most famous restaurants. You're with me, Damien said simply, as if that solved everything. They won't care what you're wearing. He was right. The moment they approached the entrance, the hostess's eyes lit with recognition, not for Lena, but for the man beside her. Mr. Levesque, what a pleasure. Your usual table? Please. They were escorted through the main dining room, past tables filled with well-dressed patrons celebrating anniversaries and closing business deals, up a staircase to a private room on the second floor. Smaller, quieter, with only 3 other tables, all empty. The walls were painted a soft cream, decorated with elegant artwork that probably cost more than Lena's yearly rent. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across white tablecloths and polished silverware. Their table was positioned by the window, offering a view of the garden below where fairy lights twinkled among the magnolia trees. Damien held her chair, the gesture so natural and practiced that Lena wondered how many women had sat across from him in rooms like this, how many had been charmed by the contrast between his dangerous reputation and his perfect manners. Wine? He asked, as a sommelier appeared with a leather-bound list. I don't know anything about wine. Then I'll choose. He ordered something in French that the sommelier seemed to approve of enthusiastically, then turned his attention back to Lena. You're nervous. I just agreed to completely change my life. Yes, I'm nervous. Good. If you weren't, I'd be worried. He leaned back as the sommelier returned with a bottle, performed the ritual of presenting, opening and pouring with practiced elegance. When they were alone again, Damien raised his glass. To new beginnings, and to the woman brave enough to trust her instincts. Lena touched her glass to his, the crystal making a pure, clear sound. The wine was rich and complex, tasting of dark fruit and something earthy she couldn't identify. She'd never had wine that cost more than $15 a bottle. This one probably cost more than her security deposit. "Tell me something," Damien said after they'd ordered. Or rather, after he'd ordered for both of them, somehow knowing she wouldn't object. "Why did you come to New Orleans? You're not from here. I can hear it in your accent. Midwest, maybe? Illinois?" "Indiana, small town outside Indianapolis." She set down her glass, surprised he'd noticed. Most people didn't catch the subtle flattening of her vowels. "I came here 3 years ago for a fresh start. Wanted to be somewhere different. Somewhere I could be anonymous. And instead, you ended up working for me. Life is weird that way." He smiled, the expression reaching his eyes for the first time. "It is. What were you running from? Indiana, I mean. What made you need a fresh start?" The question was casual, but Lena sensed the real interest behind it. This was a test, she realized. He was measuring her honesty, her willingness to be vulnerable, her ability to share information that could be used against her if he were the kind of man who weaponized people's pasts. "Nothing dramatic," she said carefully. "Just a life that felt too small. A town where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever changed. I was 22, working at a diner, dating a guy I'd known since high school, living in an apartment 2 blocks from my parents' house. And one day I woke up and realized if I stayed, that would be my entire life. Same town, same job, same everything. So I got in my car with 2 suitcases and drove until I hit a city that felt big enough to get lost in. And you chose New Orleans. I chose warmth. I was tired of Indiana winters. Figured if I was going to start over, might as well do it somewhere I wouldn't freeze half the year." She paused. "Turns out the heat here is its own kind of punishment." Damien laughed, the sound surprising in its genuineness. "That it is, but you stayed. 3 years is long enough to leave if you weren't finding what you came for. I guess I got comfortable with being invisible. It's easy here. Nobody asks questions. Nobody expects anything. You can just exist." She met his eyes. "Until you passed me that note and everything changed." "I didn't pass you a note. You passed me one. Same difference. The point is, I stopped being invisible the moment I made that choice." "Do you regret it?" She thought about the question honestly, turning it over in her mind while the server arrived with their first course. Oysters, Rockefeller, the shells arranged artfully on a bed of rock salt, still steaming. She'd never had oysters before, had always thought of them as something rich people ate while making deals that determined other people's fates. "No," she said finally, picking up the tiny fork with care. "I don't regret it. I'm terrified of what comes next, but I don't regret the choice." Terrified is honest. I respect that more than false bravado. Damien ate an oyster with practiced ease. Most people who enter my world try to act like they're not afraid, like they belong from day one. It's a performance, and usually a bad one. Fear is the appropriate response to stepping into something you don't understand. It keeps you careful, keeps you alive. Is that supposed to be reassuring? It's supposed to be true. I won't lie to you about what you're walking into, Lena. This world has rules that aren't written down. Consequences that happen in shadows. People who smile while planning your destruction. You need to understand that from the beginning. The oyster turned to ash in her mouth. Then why bring me into it at all? Why not just keep me protected from a distance like you said was an option? Because I think you're capable of more than safety. And because I need people around me who aren't already shaped by this world. You see things others miss because you haven't been trained to ignore your instincts in favor of protocol. He paused, studying her. But I also need you to enter this with full awareness. If you want to change your mind, now is the time. Before you sign anything. Before you're too deep to extract yourself cleanly. Lena set down her fork and looked at him directly. If I walk away now, what happens? You go back to your apartment. Back to Riverview. Back to your life. The protection stays. You've earned that. But the opportunity closes. I don't offer twice. And if I stay? Then starting tomorrow, you begin learning how to exist in a world where trust is currency and betrayal is common. You learn to recognize threats. You learn to protect yourself. You learn to see the patterns that others miss. His voice softened slightly. You learn to stop apologizing for taking up space and start demanding the respect you deserve. The last part hit her harder than she expected, because he was right. She'd spent her entire adult life making herself smaller, quieter, less demanding, apologizing for needing things, accepting whatever scraps were offered, and being grateful for them. And she was tired, so deeply tired of living that way. I'm staying, she said firmly. I'm signing the papers. I'm taking the job. I'm doing this. Damien's expression shifted into something that looked almost like pride. Good. Then let's enjoy dinner. Tomorrow, the real work begins. But tonight, you get to experience what it's like to not serve other people for once. The rest of the meal was extraordinary. Course after course of food Lena had only read about in magazines. Turtle soup with sherry, Gulf fish with brown butter, quail with foie gras. Each dish was a revelation, flavors so complex and perfectly balanced that she understood for the first time why people paid hundreds of dollars for meals like this. It wasn't just food, it was art, experience. A demonstration of what became possible when resources met skill, met care. Between courses, they talked. Not about business or danger or the world she was entering, but about smaller things. Books they'd read, movies that had surprised them, the strange magic of New Orleans, the way the city felt alive in ways other places didn't. Damien told her about growing up in Sicily, about learning English from American movies, about the first time he'd tasted real Cajun food, and realized Louisiana had its own kind of dangerous magic. His guard dropped incrementally as the evening progressed, the severe mask he wore in public softening into something more human. And Lena found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't expected. This man, who commanded fear with his silence and had people killed for betrayal, was also someone who could quote Tennessee Williams and debate the merits of different hot sauce brands and laugh at his own mistakes. By the time dessert arrived, bread pudding souffle that rose impossibly high and melted on her tongue, Lena had stopped thinking of him as the mafioso from Table 12 and started seeing him as just Damien. Complicated, dangerous, but also unexpectedly kind in moments when kindness wasn't required. Thank you, she said as they lingered over coffee. For this. You didn't have to do any of it. I wanted to. You deserve to be celebrated for making a hard choice. And I wanted you to see what your new life can include. Not just danger and secrecy, but also beauty, pleasure, experiences you couldn't access before. He paused. Working for me isn't just about risk. It's also about reward. The car ride back to her apartment was quiet, both of them lost in thought. When they pulled up outside her building, Damien walked her to the door despite her protests. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., someone will pick you up, he said. Bring the signed paperwork, wear comfortable clothes. The first day is orientation and basic security training. I'll be ready. He turned to leave, then paused and looked back. Lena, you made the right choice tonight. Both times. Both times? Passing me that note 3 weeks ago, and accepting my offer tonight. Both were brave. Both were right. His eyes held hers in the darkness. I'm glad you trusted your instincts. Then he was gone, moving down the sidewalk to where the car waited, leaving Lena standing on her doorstep with her heart racing and her future stretching ahead like an open road leading into darkness. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, signed the paperwork with hands that only shook a little, and set her alarm for 6 a.m. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Lena fell asleep feeling like she'd finally stopped running from herself and started running towards something that might actually be worth the risk.